Now at this point, you might be wondering why we really need to build test classes. Is this some secret trick by Salesforce to develop an army of robots that'll one day become intelligent and self-aware and take over the world? No, 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 no. Here's why Salesforce wants you to write test classes. First, they want to make sure we're writing good code. Test classes give them an additional layer of confidence to ensure we're not writing wild triggers that may break something. If we didn't have test classes, theoretically, we could write triggers that have never been verified as working, meaning we could have broken code in production and our users would be seeing errors everywhere. That's what Salesforce says, at least. What they really mean, though, is they don't want your code breaking their servers. For example, you might have a trigger that generates an infinite loop, sucking up a ton of resources. And since Salesforce is in the cloud, if you break or slow down a server, you're not only slowing it down for yourself, but for every other company out there sharing the same server with you. This would give the other companies reason to drop the cloud and adopt a competitor's on-premise solution like Oracle Siebel CRM. Finally, you know that Salesforce has 3 releases every year during the spring, summer, and winter seasons. When Salesforce makes these upgrades, they need a good way to know that their changes aren't going to break all the customizations you've made in your org. So, with every new release, Salesforce runs all the test classes in all orgs to make sure they're still working. This is a great gesture by Salesforce, and I've heard this process takes more than a month. So clearly, testing is very important to Salesforce. So important that they put their money where their mouth is and require you to write test classes. Apex development can only be done in sandboxes or developer orgs, never in production. If you ever want to deploy code into a production environment, it must come first from your sandbox. And Salesforce won't let you deploy code from your sandbox to production unless you meet the following requirements. 75% of all the lines of code you've written must be executed by test classes. So if you write a trigger that has 100 lines of code in it, your test class needs to run at least 75 lines of that trigger. This is actually a pretty lenient requirement because on the flip side, 25% of your code could be completely untested. So nevertheless, we won't shoot for the minimum 75%. We're going to get as much coverage as possible. I'll show you how Salesforce calculates this number soon. The second requirement is that all assertions in your test classes must pass. An assertion is a hypothesis you might have in your test class. For example, you might assert that whenever a lead is updated, the first name must be equal to hello and the last name must be equal to world. Normally, we manually check this by eyeballing the data, but with assertions, you can do this programmatically. If the expected and the actual results are different, your test class will tell you that something is wrong and prevent you from deploying. This is a very, very powerful asset. Although using assertions are a testing best practice, Salesforce doesn't force you to have them. But when you do, they have to pass. There's still a few more things we need to learn before we can properly make assertions, so we'll be covering that in a future course shortly. For now, we're just going to make sure we get at least 75% code coverage in our test classes. An important thing to know, all test classes in your org must pass to deploy code in production. So even if you have the minimum 75% code coverage in the trigger you're deploying, if another trigger of yours has only 50%, this could prevent your deployment, even if that other trigger is completely unrelated to yours. This might seem counterintuitive at first, but you may understand its importance if you've ever been an admin in a highly customized org. How many times have you or someone on your team written a seemingly harmless validation rule, only to later find that it broke something unrelated to it? The same thing happens with code. However, we have more checks and balances to make sure this doesn't happen as often. You never know when code you've written accidentally breaks something else that's seemingly unrelated. That's why we have test classes, and that's why we make sure all of our test classes pass, even the seemingly unrelated ones, whenever we deploy to production. So once again, test classes are your org's army of testing robots that'll do all the testing dirty work for you. It's common practice to have one dedicated test class per trigger. So we'll need a test class for each of our three main triggers: Hello World, Apple Watch, and dedupe reminder. All three would have to pass the trigger requirements if we wanted to deploy any code into production.